Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. Across the state, county school leaders say they need more money for facilities, staffing, and safety. But state spending isn't rising fast enough for counties to keep up with their needs. And the local leaders aren't finding the help they need in bills that are moving in the state legislature. WRAL education insider Emily Walkenhorst has been following the disconnect, and she joins us now. Emily, welcome back.
Great to be here.
You reached out to local officials from across the state to talk about school funding priorities. What did they tell you?
So they had plenty of priorities to share. Facilities was a big one. Every single person I talked to said facilities. It's a responsibility of counties. And also, they're saying they're falling behind on their facility projects. And we see that in reports, $12.8 billion in outstanding facility needs that did not have a dedicated funding source. That was the last number we saw in 2021, and that was like $5 billion more than what we saw in 2016. So there's a big need for facilities, new schools, renovated schools, things like that. Some buildings are just getting really old. Some buildings are unusable. Some floors are unsafe. Lots of things with facilities. We also heard, people talk about, we've got staffing issues. We need to be able to pay teachers more money. And they talked about it from the perspective of, this is really we need fundamental changes here because people aren't wanting to enter the teaching profession. So maybe there's more than just a small pay increase that's needed for teachers, but rather something that's a little more transformative for the teaching profession and for some of those smaller counties that can't afford to pay as much. They talked about safety. They talked about student mental health, needing more counselors, needing more equipment for safety, needing to work on student behavior in terms of discipline and helping make sure that classrooms are a good learning environment.
So how does that square up with what state lawmakers are proposing?
So I asked about that, are you seeing what you need to see in the budget? And for the most part, county leaders were like, well, not really. So the budget hasn't passed. All these leaders said, we talk to our legislators all the time. We have good relationships with them. They listen to us. We just understand that what ends up in a budget proposal is, a proposal, made by leadership across the state. And so they don't necessarily expect everything to be funded in that. Lawmakers this session are really pushing a plan for private school voucher spending. That will be in just 2 years. It would be over $400 million, which would be an over $300 million increase from what they're spending now on private school vouchers. And then there's been an emphasis on a lot of policy changes, but not necessarily an influx in funding. There have been some proposals for teacher raises, but they're at, I believe in the Senate budget, experienced teachers would get only $250 in a raise, and then some younger teachers would get, maybe a few thousand. And so maybe there's a question there of, what kind of an impact those would make.
Now, $300 million going towards private schools, that's a lot of money. How would that affect public schools?
So it has to do with the funding model that funds public schools. So for every student, or schools receive money for every student. So it's a slightly different amount of money depending on the school and depending on the student. But basically, if a student were to move from a public school to a private school, the school loses funding for that student.
The public school.
The public school. So that could be a small situation, if it's only one student. But there's a lack of predictability with that to some extent. And also, if you lost a handful of students, but it wasn't enough to change more fixed costs, like the number of teachers you still need, or, even just like maintenance, air conditioning bills, things like that, you would lose money for that student, but the amount of money you need to spend to make that school operate doesn't necessarily change by the exact same amount of money. So public schools would lose funding, and there's a concern over fixed costs.
How would a county account for that? How do they reconcile that? How do they make up for that loss if that happens?
So we can see what's happened in some more rural counties, which have just lost population in recent years. Some have lost students to private schools or charter schools, but in some cases, they're just losing students to population. And what's happened there partly is they've just found some of the more simple things to cut. They're thinking we can't close a school, we can't, cut certain things. So what they do instead, oftentimes, is they cut a program. So instead of offering a career and technical program in, some kind of construction or industrial program, like they would just cut that. For example, or they would cut some kind of elective where they don't have to buy the supplies or fund that teacher anymore. So what they're doing is they're cutting programming and not necessarily just, little costs here or there.
Now, an alternative would be to raise revenue. These are counties, these are governments that have taxing power. Is that a consideration?
So it's a political issue, Does that county feel like there's room to increase property taxes? So a lot, especially more rural counties that would take a bigger hit with a population loss, a lot of them have high property tax rates compared to a lot of the rest of the state. So they might feel like politically there's not much of an appetite to raise property taxes. And property taxes are something voters have to approve of changes to.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear more about public school spending priorities. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL Education Insider Emily Walkenhorst about a disconnect in public school funding priorities in North Carolina. Emily, you spoke with leaders on both sides of the political spectrum, including some who support private school vouchers. How did they reconcile their beliefs with their spending priorities?
So a lot of them are conservative, and they support school choice, which is a big part of the Republican Party's platform. Even though perhaps there are, very education-oriented people, they support school choice, whether that's a charter school or a private school. But then they kind of had maybe a different perspective on that, where they thought, well, I support school choice, but, originally this program is really supposed to be for lower income students. And some of these higher income students, perhaps just their families don't need this funding. And, what it comes down to is, they can point to different line items in their own budget that they want to increase. Like they just want to see, an influx in funds. If the state is going to spend more money, if they have this money for private school vouchers, there's a discomfort with the idea that money would go to private schools versus public schools, where they have this laundry list of things they would like to see.
You mentioned that school security is also top of mind. What are the funding concerns there?
So school security was a very wide-ranging kind of topic for a lot of leaders, that really fits into the facilities category. Can we do things to build barriers around our campuses? They found, just different things about older school design are perhaps less safe or secure than more modern school design. So they like to see more construction of security vestibules, which are kind of a two-door set situation where you have a set of doors and you have to walk through that set of doors, but you also have to talk to somebody in administration. They have to check you in, verify you and everything before they actually open that second set of doors and let you in. So the idea is every school should have that, but that can be a multi-million-dollar investment for some older schools just because that's considered a major renovation. And so, if it's not an ADA compliant school, that means they have to upgrade those things. And there's just a lot that goes into some of these expenses.
A number of the local leaders you spoke with also pointed to student behavior as something that needs addressing. What did they say?
So that's also a broad topic. So, student behavioral health is a major concern. So I talked to several people and, really I've talked to people for years about this, about how students need more help. Mental health among students has been, or among young people has been more and more challenging over the years. We've seen statistics getting worse and worse for 15 years now about depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts. And, people, especially young people, can really carry how they're feeling, throughout the day, everywhere they go, including schools. And so a lot of local leaders just want to see more investment in psychologists, counselors. Parents have to play a part there, agree that their child should see a psychologist. But having somebody who's available on campus, even just to handle, fights between students or, the kind of smaller things it's kind of just a check-in with students and not an actual psychological service, can really make a big difference. And they've been saying for years they're really understaffed for that.
And what about academics? Schools are still dealing with learning loss from the pandemic. How does that figure into their priorities?
So it figures in a number of ways. There's this idea that if you can have a safe school, if you can address students' behavioral health needs, you can have a stronger school, one where teachers are able to teach better. They're not distracted by students who are distracted by their phones or distracted by just not wanting to be there. So it's kind of more of a collective effort among all of the different things that help a school run, that the smoother the school can run, the better the education they can provide. There's also, other concerns about different types of students who need more intervention. So one county leader talked about how special education students are really at an even worse disadvantage sometimes because they lost this learning, but they already needed more intervention in the first place. And there's a lot of underfunding there. I had several leaders mention that as a concern, that students in special education were already not getting the interventions they need. So, in the next year or so, a lot of this federal pandemic relief dollars, much of which has honestly been spent on facility repairs and HVAC unit upgrades and teacher bonuses, just trying to make sure employees, the schools themselves are staffed and employees are happy. And, that money is going to run out in just over 12 months. So they're funding interventions with that money now, and that's going to disappear. So a lot of these county leaders are really thinking ahead to not just trying to make sure a school runs smoothly and is fully staffed, but also, are we able to provide interventions and programming that students need long term?
Will the negotiations over the budget yield any changes that sort of address more of the priorities of these local leaders?
So there are a few things that are in the budget that perhaps there's really just a disagreement between the Senate and the House on. So it looks like educators will get raises next year, but it's just unclear how much. Like the Senate is offering just, a couple thousand to just $250 per year for more experienced teachers in terms of a raise. And it looks like the final budget could include more than that because the House wants to provide maybe $3,000 to $4,000 in raises to teachers. So we will see some help for teachers in that way. The House and Senate are also deciding whether they want to increase funding for a local supplement to help smaller counties provide even more funding to their teachers. That's currently $175 million, and I believe one of the chambers wants to increase that, the other one doesn't. So we'll see what happens there. Some things that are not in the budget. There doesn't appear to be a huge increase for, safety. There will probably be some safety grants in there. There has been an increase in the last year or so for that. Those are just one-time grants. They might just be several $1,000s per project. There has been some facility funding increase in terms of lottery proceeds. So that's not from the state's general fund. That's not from the state's revenue. That's really just from lottery revenue. So it's possible lawmakers will keep some of that money kind of high from the lottery, but it's still not really where counties say they need it to be.
Well, we know you'll be watching as this develops. Thanks, Emily.
Always glad to be here.
That's WRAL Education Insider Emily Walkenhorst. For her in-depth analysis of education spending priorities, visit the education section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making this part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.